The file doesn't exist. That's what they'll tell you if you ask. There's no case number, no incident report, no internal memo, no record of the 8 people who vanished from a 1.2-mile stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Haywood County, North Carolina, all within a 40-year window, all from the same section of trail, all during the last 2 weeks of September. There's no record of the ranger who investigated it, and there's certainly no record of what he found inside that mountain. But in September of 1994, a man named Thomas Elias Dowd opened a case that the National Park Service buried so fast and so deep that even the rangers who worked alongside him are only now beginning to talk. This is that case. Before I give you the story, I need to give you the context, because what happened in 1994 didn't start in 1994. It started in 1954. That's when the first recorded disappearance occurred, along a stretch of trail that locals had always called the Fold, a half-mile depression between 2 ridgelines near a place marked on older maps as Mabry Gap, a name that stopped appearing on official trail maps after 1961, not because the place stopped existing, but because someone decided it would be better if people stopped looking for it. The Appalachian Trail through Haywood County runs through some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States. People forget that. They think of the Appalachian Trail as a recreational corridor, something managed, maintained, accessible, and most of it is. Most of it has shelters with registers and blazes painted every 100 yards, and other hikers passing through with enough regularity that if something goes wrong, someone notices within a day or two. But there are sections of these mountains, sections deep in the folds between ridgelines, where the canopy closes overhead, and the trail drops into terrain that the afternoon sun never fully reaches, where that comfort disappears entirely, where you can walk for hours without seeing another person or hearing anything man-made, where the Appalachian Mountains stop being a park and start being a park and start being what they have always been: old, indifferent, vast, beyond any individual's ability to fully comprehend. Mabry Gap was one of those sections. The first to go was a man named Carl Bettis, 41 years old, an experienced trail walker from Asheville, who'd been putting miles under his boot since before the Appalachian Trail had a proper register system. He knew mountains the way working men know their tools, practically, without sentimentality. He didn't romanticize the wilderness, he respected it, which is a different thing entirely. He signed the register at the Mabry Gap shelter on September 14th, 1954. He was supposed to sign out at the next shelter, 8 miles north, the following morning. He never did. Search parties found his gear. His tent was pitched 200 yards off the main trail, deep in the fold section. His food supply was untouched. His canteen was full. His firing showed evidence of a fire that had been built and allowed to burn down naturally, not extinguished in a hurry, not kicked apart. A fire that had simply been left to go out on its own. And his boots, well worn, size 10.5, the leather darkened by months of trail grease and mountain weather, were placed neatly at the tent entrance, facing outward, like he'd stepped out and expected to come back. Carl Bettis never came back. Over the next 40 years, 7 more people vanished from the same stretch of trail, not from the broader Appalachian Trail system, from that specific 1.2-mile section, the section that begins where the trail dips into the fold and ends where it climbs back out, where the light returns and the compass settles and the temperature rises back to what the season promises. 8 people. 4 decades, all in the last 2 weeks of September, all from the same section, all with gear left behind, all with boots removed and placed at the tent entrance, facing outward. The National Park Service knew about the pattern. They had known since 1972, when a park ranger named Gerald Mabry, and yes, his family name was the same as the gap, and no, that's not a coincidence, I'll leave unexplained, submitted a 34-page internal report connecting all 8 disappearances. He sent it to his district supervisor. The report was reviewed. Gerald Mabry was transferred the following week. The report was sealed. Nobody talked about Mabry Gap after that. These are the kinds of Appalachian legends that don't get written down in any official capacity. They get passed between people who know better than to say them loud. In ranger stations, after the administrative staff has gone home, in roadside diners along Highway 19, in the cabs of trucks idling at trailheads, in the gray pre-dawn dark. Ghost stories, people call them when they want to feel like the mountains are still something they understand, when they need the comfortable distance that the word story provides. Until Thomas Dowd, the mountains kept their secret just fine. Thomas Ilias Dowd was 37 years old in the fall of 1994. He'd spent 12 years as a park ranger in the Pisgah district, the North Carolina section of the Appalachian Trail, through Haywood County into Madison County up toward the Tennessee line. He knew this stretch of mountain the way some men know the layout of their own home, in the dark. Every shelter, every creek crossing, every section where the trail gets treacherous in wet weather, where exposed root systems grab at your ankles, where the fog rolls in from the valley floors so thick you can lose the blaze marks 15 feet ahead of you. He'd worked search and rescue cases. He pulled people out of hypothermia. He'd recovered bodies from falls. He had the particular competence of a man who has spent 12 years learning one place very thoroughly, who has watched it in every season and every weather condition and every quality of light until the mountain has become something he carries inside him, a 3-dimensional map that operates below conscious thought. His colleagues described him as methodical, quiet, the kind of park ranger who filed every report on time, who remembered the names of every hiker he'd ever pulled out of distress, who never skipped a shelter inspection, even in bad weather, because he understood, in a way that newer rangers sometimes had to learn the hard way, that the one time you skip the inspection is always the time that matters. He kept his personal notebook in his truck, not in any station cabinet. He took his own photographs with his own camera. He was, in the precise sense of the word, the kind of ranger that an institution hopes for. Thorough, careful, procedurally sound, right up until the moment when that thoroughness became a problem. He was not a superstitious man. He'd heard the old stories, the Appalachian Horror Stories that circulate in ranger stations after dark, that the older rangers tell the younger ones, with the particular pleasure of watching someone try to decide whether or not to believe them. Disappearances without explanation, lights in the woods that don't correspond to any known source, sections of trail where the search and rescue dogs plant their feet and simply will not move forward, regardless of what command is given, where they whine low in their chests and press back against the handler's legs, with a certainty that has nothing to do with training and everything to do with something. Older, he'd heard them, the way you hear stories told around a fire. Present, interested, noting the details with the part of his brain that noted all details, but not carrying them home, not letting them change how he walked into the woods in the morning, or how he slept at night. That was about to change. Jacob Pruitt signed the Mabry Gap Shelter Register. On September 1894, he was 29 years old, a section hiker from Knoxville, Tennessee, who'd been walking the Appalachian Trail in segments for 2 years, working south to north in pieces, fitting the trail around his job at an engineering firm, the way disciplined people approach large projects, methodical, patient, committed to seeing the thing through. He had a spreadsheet at home that tracked his mileage by section, by date, by shelter, the kind of document that reveals a man who finds genuine satisfaction in the act of completing what he starts. He left a detailed itinerary with his wife, Carol, before he drove out to the trailhead. Shelter names, daily mileage estimates, weather contingencies, a list of payphone numbers along the route sourced from a trail guide he'd had for 3 years. He checked the forecast for the week. He packed for rain, even though the forecast was clear, because he was that kind of man. He called Carol from the trailhead parking lot on his way in. "I'll call you Thursday from Hot Springs," he said. "I know," she said. "Be careful. I always am." He knew what he was doing. He had the right gear, the right maps, the right experience. He had walked harder sections than this one, in worse weather, and come out exactly when he said he would. He was supposed to call Carol from a payphone in Hot Springs, North Carolina, on September 21st. He never called. Carol Pruitt contacted the ranger station on September 22nd. Her voice, according to the intake notes Dowd later reviewed, was controlled. She was not panicking. She was a woman who had decided that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford until she had more information. Thomas Dowd was assigned the case. He drove out to the Mabry Gap trailhead at 6:00 a.m. On September 23rd, before the mist had lifted from the valley, the mountains were dark shapes against a gray sky, the way they always look in September, when the light hasn't committed yet to the day, when everything is outline and suggestion, and you have to take it on faith that the color is coming. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold stone, that particular September smell of the Appalachian Mountains that has no exact equivalent anywhere else. That smell that means summer is finished and the mountain is beginning to withdraw into itself for the long season ahead. He expected to find a twisted ankle, a case of mild hypothermia, a hiker who'd sheltered in place during a weather event and lost track of his schedule. He figured he'd be back at the station by evening with a mildly embarrassed Jacob Pruitt in the passenger seat. He found the shelter first. Jacob's name was in the register. September 18th, 7:42 p.m. Short entry, written in the abbreviated style of a tired hiker. Good trail conditions, weather clear, heading north at dawn. Nothing unusual about it. The handwriting of a man who was tired and had tomorrow's miles already mapped in his head and wanted nothing more than to get his boots off and get into his sleeping bag. But below Jacob's entry, written in a different hand, darker ink, heavier pressure, the letters formed with a deliberate care that felt less like casual annotation and more like inscription, was a single line. He was here. The fold took him the way it takes all of them. No date, no name. Dowd photographed it. He stood there for a moment, looking at a line, feeling the particular unease of a detail that doesn't fit the expected shape of a situation. Then he told himself it was graffiti, a prank, someone with a taste for drama and too much time on a trail that didn't see much foot traffic. He kept walking. 1.5 miles north of the shelter, he found the campsite. The tent was still standing, rain fly secured, zipper pulled down from the outside, the way you'd leave it if you'd stepped out briefly and didn't want wind getting in. Not the way you'd leave it if you were abandoning it. Inside, sleeping bag rolled out flat, undisturbed. Headlamp on the ground with a dead battery, positioned near the tent entrance, where you'd leave it if you'd used it the night before, and set it down without thinking. A paperback novel lying open, face down on the sleeping pad, spine cracked at the breaking point, a bookmark displaced to the floor beside it, the kind of detail that means someone was in the middle of something and fully intended to come back to it. Jacob's backpack was leaning against a hemlock tree, 10 feet from the tent, packed and ready, the way a hiker packs who knows exactly what they're doing. Weight distributed correctly, straps properly cinched, the small discipline of a man who has carried miles enough to know that how you pack matters. His boots were at the tent entrance. Facing out, Dowd stood there for a longer moment than he would later admit in his report, looking at those boots in the grey morning light. They were Vasquez leather hikers, well broken in, the kind of boot that takes months of trail to fit properly to a foot. That becomes, in time, almost a part of the body that an experienced hiker treats with a specific and practical reverence. A man who'd been walking this trail in segments for 2 years would know exactly what those boots represented. He wouldn't leave them outside deliberately. He wouldn't leave them at all, unless he believed absolutely that he was stepping out for a moment and would be right back. Dowd photographed the scene methodically, working in a grid pattern outward from the tent. He catalogued every item. He told himself the boots meant nothing specific, that there was an explanation, that the explanation was close and would reveal itself if he kept working. He began his sweep of the perimeter. That's when he found the journal. It wasn't inside the tent. It wasn't in the pack. It was sitting on a flat rock, 30 yards from the campsite, dead center on the rock surface, positioned with a precision that felt less like someone had set it down and more like someone had placed it. The way you'd place something you wanted found. The way you'd leave. A message. A brown leather journal. No name on the cover. The leather darkened at the corners from handling, from the oils of someone's hands, over the weeks of a long trail walk. Dowd opened it. The first 20 pages were exactly what you'd expect. Trail notes in Jacob Pruitt's handwriting. Carol would later confirm it, sitting across from Dowd at the station, with her hands folded very carefully in her lap, speaking in the controlled voice of a woman who has made a decision about how she is going to hold herself together. Through this, day-by-day entries from the beginning of the trip, shelter names, times, distances, weather observations, small notes about the trail itself, a section of particularly good ridge walking, a creek crossing that was higher than the map suggested, a shelter with a broken door that should be reported, the ordinary, careful record of a man moving through the Appalachian Mountains with attention and purpose. And then, on September 17th, the day before Jacob signed the shelter register, the day he would have been moving through the fold section for the first time, the entries changed. I've been hearing it for 2 nights now, a sound like breathing, low and close, like it's coming from inside the ground itself, from somewhere beneath the root systems and the stone. I told myself it was wind moving through the gap in the ridge, but there's no wind, not a breath of it. The trees are completely still and the air doesn't move and the sound keeps coming. I told myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, or something smaller, moving through the underbrush. But animals don't breathe like that. This is slow, measured, deliberate, like whatever is making the sound is doing it on purpose, like it knows I'm awake and listening, and it wants me to know. It knows. Dowd turned to September 18th. The breathing stopped last night around 3 a.m. I didn't sleep after that. Not because the sound kept me awake, because the silence did. There is a quality to the silence in this section of trail that I don't have words for. Like the woods are waiting. The trail through the fold feels different in a way I cannot make rational. The light doesn't fall the same way it does on the rest of the trail. The shadows are at the wrong angles for the time of day, like the sun is somewhere slightly other than where it should be. The trees lean in too close overhead. The ground gives a little too much under my boots, a softness where there should be packed earth and root, like there's something hollow underneath. I don't want to stop here. I know I don't want to stop here, but I'm too tired to push through to the next shelter. I'll make camp just past the Marbury Gap shelter, just for 1 night. 1 night, and I'll be through it. Then Dowd turned to the next page. September 19th. He stopped reading, not because the entry disturbed him, because the journal continued. Past September 19th, September 20th, September 21st, September 22nd, 3 more entries, dated across the days after Jacob Pruitt had already failed to call his wife. After the days when, by any reasonable accounting, a man who'd simply gotten into trouble on the trail should have been found or reported, or at minimum located by the network of other hikers that moves through this section of the Appalachian Trail. Like a slow, irregular current, Dowd turned to September 21st, the day Jacob was supposed to call Carol from Hot Springs. I understand now. I understand why no one ever leaves. The ranger will come. He always comes. But it won't matter. The fold doesn't let the searchers see it. Only the ones who stay can see what it is. The searchers walk through when they feel wrong, and they note it in their field books, and they explain it away, and they walk back out. Only the ones who sleep here understand. I tried to walk out this morning. I walked for 2 hours on the trail heading north. My hand touched the trailhead post at the far end of the section, and then I was back at the campsite, standing at my tent, with no memory of walking back, with no memory of anything between the post and the tent. It doesn't hurt. That's the worst part of it. It doesn't hurt at all. There's no pain. There's no cold. There's just the fold and the trees and the others at the tree line and the breathing that comes up through the ground at night and the terrible, patient quiet of a place that has been doing this for a very long time and has never once been in a hurry. Dowd closed the journal. He was a 12-year veteran who didn't traffic in old stories, a methodical man who believed in evidence and procedure and the patient work of finding the rational explanation that was always there if you looked carefully enough. But sitting on that flat rock in the cold September woods, holding a journal with entries that extended past the date its author had disappeared, entries that described experiences from inside a disappearance, written in the unmistakable hand of a man who was not supposed to be writing anything anymore. Thomas Dowd felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child, not the managed fear of a dangerous situation, where training takes over and your hands go steady and you move through the problem step by step. The other kind, the kind that lives below the rational mind, below language, below the part of you that files reports and maintains evidence chains, the kind that is very old and knows things your conscious mind has spent years convincing itself aren't true. He stood up. He pocketed the journal. He walked back to the shelter, radioed the station, and requested a search and rescue team in a level voice that gave nothing away. The search and rescue team arrived at 1:15 p.m. That afternoon, they spent 4 days in the field, dogs, grid searchers across the full perimeter and beyond, pushing out in every direction from the campsite in expanding rings. Aerial support from a helicopter out of Asheville that rattled over the ridgelines in the grey September sky, its rotors audible long before and long after it was visible. The sound bouncing off the mountains in ways that made it seem to be coming from everywhere at once. They found nothing. No blood, no signs of a fall, no indication of foul play of any recognizable kind. No footprints leading away from the campsite in any direction, except for a single boot-printed path heading back toward the main trail that ended abruptly 40 yards from where the tent was pitched. 40 yards of boot prints pressed cleanly into the soft earth. Then, bare ground, no scuff marks, no drag marks, no compression suggesting a body had fallen or been moved. Just prints, and then an absence of prints, as cleanly delineated as a line drawn on a map, as if a man had taken 40 steps and then ceased to exist, in any form that left marks on the physical world. On September 27th, the active search was suspended. Jacob Pruitt was listed as a missing person. One more name added to the long and imperfect ledger of people who walk into the Appalachian Mountains and don't walk out. A ledger that the Park Service tracks with careful bureaucratic neutrality, that lists the missing alongside the found, that uses the word unresolved with a precision that feels, in certain cases, like a deliberate evasion. Thomas Dowd didn't stop. He went back to the ranger station archives that night and started pulling files. He told himself he was just being thorough, but detail about the boots kept nagging at him, not forming into a complete thought, not resolving into anything actionable, just sitting at the edge of his mind the way a detail does, when it knows it means something you aren't ready to face yet. He pulled files the way a methodical man does, systematically, starting at the oldest cabinet, working forward. He found the first file in the bottom drawer of the oldest cabinet in the records room, behind a row of trail maintenance reports from the early 1960s, a manila folder, water-stained at the edges, the paper inside brittle with age. Paper clipped to the front cover was a handwritten note on a half-sheet of station letterhead. Supervisor's directive: this file is to be retained but not referenced in active case research. Do not cross-reference with current casework. DTH, 1961, Dowd. Opened the folder. Carl Bettis, 1954. The same details he'd encountered in old summaries. He'd seen the name once or twice in passing, the way you see names in records rooms when you're looking for something else, briefly and without context. But beneath the official report, folded once and tucked beneath it, was a handwritten page, a personal note from the ranger who'd worked the scene, never entered into the official record, preserved here in the bottom of a drawer for 33 years, because whoever had filed it couldn't quite bring themselves to destroy it entirely. Bettis's boots were placed at the tent entrance, facing outward. The ground around the tent was soft from rain the previous day. There were no footprints of any kind leading away from the boots, not toward the trail, not into the woods, not in any direction. The ground directly around the boots showed the impressions of a man standing, and then nothing. I have no explanation for this. I have not included it in the official report because I was told not to. I am including it here because I think someone should know. Dode sat with that page for a long time. Then he started pulling everything. Some files were thin. A single page with a name and the word Unresolved stamped in red. The bureaucratic shorthand for "we stopped looking and officially we are at peace with that." Others were thicker, with rangers' notes and search team logs, and in 2 cases, personal correspondence from family members that had been filed with the case and never responded to. But every file that had an attached personal note from the working ranger referenced the same detail. Boots placed at the tent entrance, facing outward, no footprints leading away. 8 times, over 40 years, he found Gerald Mabry's 1972 report, the one that was supposed to have been sealed. Someone had kept a copy, misfiled under a different reference number in a folder labeled Trail Maintenance, Haywood County, 1971-1973, buried in the middle of a stack of reports about drainage work and blaze repainting. 34 pages, single-spaced, as methodical and careful as the man who'd written it. The work of someone who understood that he might only get one chance to put this on record and was going to make it count. Mabry had done exactly what Dowd was doing now, pulling the old files, looking for the pattern underneath the individual cases, and he'd found it. Not just the boots, not just the September dates, something else. All 8 hikers had stayed in the same section of trail. The fold. All 8 had signed the Mabry Gap Shelter Register within 2 days of disappearing, and all 8, every single one, had left behind some form of written record. A journal, a note, a letter. One of them, a man from Raleigh who had vanished in September of 1978, had left a cassette tape recorder running inside his pack. The record button still depressed when searchers found it. The tape run to its end. Mabry had transcribed portions of that recording in his report. Dowd read it at 1:00 a.m. under the single bulb of the archive room. The station empty and silent around him, the Appalachian mountains dark. Beyond the window. I know I should leave. I've been trying to leave. I've been trying to leave. I've walked the trail out of here 4 times today, and I keep ending up back at the same spot. I've marked trees with my knife. I've used my compass on every bearing. I've tried going off trail entirely, pushing through the underbrush in a straight line north by the compass. Every single time, I come back to this clearing. There's something in the fold. It's not an animal. It's not a person. I don't have words for what it is, and I've been trying to find them for 3 days now. All I know is that when the breathing starts, that low sound that comes from somewhere under the ground, rhythmic and patient and horribly aware, the trail stops working the way trails are supposed to work. You can walk the right direction. You can see the right landmarks. You can count your steps and keep your compass true, and you still can't leave. If someone finds this tape, please tell my family I tried. Tell them I walked north 4 times today. Tell them I used the compass. Tell them I wasn't careless. If someone finds this tape, tell my family I wasn't scared. That's a lie. I've been scared since the first night. I'm telling that lie because it's the only thing left I can do for them. Marbury's report concluded with a formal recommendation. The fold section of trail should be permanently closed. The archived documents cross-referenced in a unified missing persons file, and a formal investigation into possible atmospheric or geophysical anomalies in the Mabry Gap area, commissioned through the Forest Service and reviewed at the federal level. His supervisor's handwritten response was at the bottom of the final page, scrawled in the impatient hand of a man who had already decided before he read it. Transfer approved. File sealed. Do not discuss. The trail stays open. 5 words that had buried 8 missing persons cases across 4 decades. Thomas Dowd went home. At 3:00 a.m., he didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with the notes he'd copied by hand and the photographs he'd taken with his personal camera and looked at them for a long time in the dark. The way you'll look at something when you're trying to decide whether you are the kind of person who is going to do the thing that is required of you, whether your sense of what the job means is strong enough to survive the consequences of following it somewhere you were explicitly not supposed to go. He decided, what Dowd found the next morning, in a place he was absolutely certain he had already cleared, is the part of this story that the park rangers who heard about it still refuse to explain. Stay with me. He went back to Mabry Gap on September 30th, alone. He told his supervisor he was doing a standard follow-up sweep of the campsite perimeter to close out the scene documentation. Standard procedure. His supervisor signed off without questions, with the mild disinterest of a man who trusted Dowd's judgment, because 12 years of accurate reports had earned that trust. The search and rescue team had cleared out days earlier. Jacob's tent and belongings had been bagged, tagged, and transported back to the station, catalogued in the evidence chain with Dowd's own signature on the custody forms, his name, his date, his handwriting, confirming that each item had been removed from the scene and secured. There was nothing left out there but a cleared patch of dirt and that flat rock. But Dowd needed to walk the fold himself, needed to put his own boots on that 1.2-mile section and feel the rational explanations settle into place, the way rational explanations were supposed to, quietly, without drama, the puzzle assembling itself from pieces he'd simply overlooked. He reached the shelter at 9:00 a.m. The register was still there, Jacob's entry from September 18th, 7:42 p.m., and below it, in that heavier hand, the same line. He was here. The fold took him the way it takes all of them. He walks north. The change in the trail was subtle, and that subtlety was part of what made it unsettling. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated. The light shifted first, just as Jacob's journal had described. Not darker exactly, not like clouds moving across the sun, but more as though the shadows were falling at angles that didn't correspond to where the sun actually was, as if light were behaving here by slightly different rules. Dowd checked his watch. 9:47 a.m., full September daylight, on a clear morning. The shadows were wrong. He wrote it in his field notebook, in exactly those words. Shadows falling at incorrect angles for 9:47 a.m., clear sky. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, flatly, without interpretation, letting the observation exist without forcing a conclusion onto it. He was a methodical man. He kept walking. Temperature dropped over the next 200 yards, gradually, not sharply. Not the sudden cold of a weather change, but the slow, deliberate cooling of moving into a different space entirely, until he could see his breath, clouding before him in the September morning air. A detail that shouldn't have been possible. At that elevation, in that season, on a clear day, his compass needle drifted slightly west when he was walking directly north by the trail blazes. He noted it, kept walking. Halfway through the fold, he reached the flat rock. There was a journal on it, brown leather, no name on the cover. He stood 3 feet from it, without moving, for 2 full minutes, not frozen, thinking, processing, with the systematic mind of a park ranger who had spent 12 years learning to be precise about what he knew and what he didn't know. What he didn't know. What he knew was this. He had watched Jacob Pruitt's brown leather journal get bagged and numbered. On September 23rd, he had signed the chain of custody form himself in his own handwriting, with his own pen. That journal was in an evidence bag at the ranger station right now, sealed and documented. He opened the one on the rock. The first 20 pages were Jacob's trail notes, same handwriting, same entries. The post-disappearance entries were there. September 19th, 20th, 21st. But now there were more. New pages that had not been there before. Pages that continued the journal into days that had not existed when Dowd first found it. September 23rd, September 25th, September 25th, September 27th. Dates when Jacob Pruitt had already been officially listed as a missing person. Dates when a search team was still working the field around him, within a mile of where he apparently still was. Dates when this journal was supposed to be in an evidence bag, at a ranger station, 30 miles away. September 23rd. The searchers came today. I could hear the dogs. I could hear voices. I recognized one voice, low and methodical, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who does this work seriously. I tried to call out. I opened my mouth. There was no sound. The fold took my voice the way it takes everything else, just absorbed it, the way a room that's been sealed too long absorbs sound, until the sound simply stops existing. I followed them to the edge of what I can reach. There's a boundary I can feel, but not see. Not a wall, not a line on the ground, just a place where movement stops being possible. Like pressing against glass. The glass bends, it never breaks. September 25th. The ranger came back. He walked the trail 3 times today. He walked directly past the rock twice. He never looked at it. I wanted to move the journal to where he'd find it. I can move things inside the fold. I moved it to the rock. I don't know if it crosses over. I don't know if he can see it. I watched him for 6 hours. I wanted to call out. I couldn't make a sound. The fold doesn't stop you from thinking. That is the cruelest part of it. Your mind stays completely clear. You can think. You can remember. You can feel. You can watch the world keep moving around you with a clarity that is almost unbearable. You just can't reach it, like you're behind glass, right there on the other side, but behind glass. September 27th. There are others here. I've been aware of them since the beginning, but I kept my distance the way you keep your distance from strangers in an unfamiliar place until you understand the rules. But today, Carl came to where I was sitting. I know his name without being told. I don't know how I know it. I just do. The fold gives you that. Somehow, the names of the others, the way a family knows each other, without introduction. Carl Bettis. He's been here since 1954. He looks 41 years old. He has looked 41 years old for 40 years. He hasn't aged a single day inside this space. He sat with me for a while. He didn't say much. There isn't much to say that the situation doesn't already say for itself. The fold doesn't kill you. That's what I keep coming back to. It doesn't kill you, it doesn't hurt you, it just keeps you preserved, present, aware, on the other side of a glass wall that you can see through, but never break. Carl has been pressing against that glass for 40 years. Dowd took the journal. He walked back to the shelter and radioed his supervisor. His voice was level, because Dowd had spent 12 years developing a voice that stayed level when it needed to. This is Dowd. I need you to get me contact above district level, today. The Marbury Gap case. I need to talk to someone above you about what I found. A pause on the radio. Longer than a technical pause. I'll see what I can do. Head back to the station. He drove back. He never got the number he asked for. Instead, 2 men arrived at the station the following morning. Not in ranger uniforms. No visible identification offered. Though Dowd asked twice. They were polite and professional, in the way of men who have practiced being both, who understand that a certain calibrated courtesy makes conversations like this one go more smoothly. They sat across from Dowd in the break room, with coffee cups on the table between them, and asked him to walk them through everything. He did. All of it. The boots, the journals, the pattern in the archive, going back to 1954. Gerald Mabry's sealed report, the cassette tape transcript, the compass drift, and the wrong shadows, and the temperature drop. His conversation with Howell Tate, which he had not yet mentioned to anyone. When he got to the second journal, the one he'd found on the rock that morning, the one that shouldn't exist, he reached into his bag. The bag was empty. The 2 men told Dowd it was possible he'd left the journal at the scene. He told them that was not possible. They smiled, in the way of men who are accustomed to having the last word on questions of possibility. Not unkindly, but with a finality that wasn't open to discussion. They thanked him for his thoroughness. They said the case was being reviewed at a higher level, and that he would be contacted with further instructions within the week. They left. That afternoon, Dowd went back to the archive room. The Marbury Gap files were gone. Not all of the files, just those. Every folder connected to that section of trail. The Bettis file from 1954, the 1961 file, the 1967 file, Gerald Mabry's report from 1972, in its misfiled location in the maintenance folder. The cabinet drawers still held other files, undisturbed, exactly where they'd been. The gap where the Marbury Gap files had been was clean and empty, the way a space looks when something has been removed carefully and deliberately, rather than in haste. Dowd sat down in that empty archive room, on a chair that creaked under him, and understood, with complete and sudden clarity, exactly how this had worked. Every time, over 40 years, someone disappeared. A park ranger investigated. The ranger found the pattern. The ranger was transferred. The files were sealed. The trail stayed open. It had worked 8 times. They expected it to work a 9th. But Thomas Dowd had made personal notes in a separate notebook he kept in his truck, not in any station cabinet, not in any system they could access without going through him directly. He had photographs taken with his own camera, not the department-issued one. The film already developed and printed and tucked into a manila envelope he'd left at his home. He had a copy of the chain of custody form for Jacob's journal, with his own signature on it, proving it had been bagged and removed from the scene. He had Gerald Mabry's cassette transcript, copy by hand, word by word, the night he found it, and he had one name buried in an old personnel directory he'd been cross-referencing while reading the 1972 report, checking to see which rangers had worked which cases, in which years. A park ranger named Hal Tate, he had worked the 1967 disappearance, the third case in the pattern. He'd been transferred the following month, like the others, to a district far enough away that he wouldn't have occasion to visit the records room or speak casually to colleagues about old cases. But unlike the others, Tate's personnel file still carried a forwarding address from when he left, a line in the file that should have been removed, but hadn't been. The small administrative oversight that sometimes changes things. A town called Spruce Pine, 45 minutes south, on Route 226. Dowd drove there. That night, Hal Tate was 71 years old. He lived at the end of a gravel road outside Spruce Pine, the kind of property that takes 3 wrong turns to find in daylight and is invisible at night, unless you already know it's there. A small house with a covered porch, a garden gone to seed for the fall, a dog that came to the end of the porch steps and watched Dowd's headlights come up the road without barking. When Tate opened the door and saw the ranger uniform, something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, not quite relief, something in between. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a knock on a particular door for 27 years and has spent that time deciding exactly what he's going to say when it comes. "Come in," he said. I wondered if someone was going to come eventually. They sat at the kitchen table. Tate poured coffee without being asked, with the automatic hospitality of a man who has lived alone long enough that small domestic courtesies have become a kind of structure, a way of imposing order on a conversation before it begins. "You worked the 1967 case," Dowd said. Tate nodded slowly. The man's name was Stephen Cole, 24 years old, from Charlotte. His sister reported him missing when he didn't come home. On schedule. His sister reported him missing when he didn't come home. On schedule. The boots were at the tent entrance, facing outward. "That's right." Tate looked at his coffee cup. "You've been in the archive." "Until someone cleaned it out." Tate nodded, unsurprised. Dowd told him about Jacob Pruitt, about finding the journal twice, the same journal, in 2 places, containing entries from days when it shouldn't have been possible to write them. About the September 25th entry that described watching a ranger walk the trail 3 times, without looking at the rock. About Carl Bettis being named. About the fold doesn't kill you, it just keeps you. He read Tate the September 27th entry in full. Tate stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room. For a long time, looking out at the dark yard, the garden, the tree line at the edge of his property. The dog moved across the porch outside, nails clicking on the old wood. "There's something you need to understand," he said finally, without turning around. "This isn't a haunting. It's not a ghost story. Ghost stories are about the dead. They're about what the dead leave behind, what they can't release, what unfinished business keeps them tethered to a place." He turned around. "The people in the fold aren't dead. They haven't left anything behind. They're still there, fully present, fully aware. They just can't get out." Dowd said nothing. He waited, with the patience of a man who has learned that silence is sometimes the most effective tool in a conversation. "In 1967, Tate continued, settling back into his chair, setting his hands flat on the table in front of him. "I spent 3 days in the fold section trying to find Stephen Cole. He'd been missing for 11 days when I got the assignment. On the second night, I saw them." He paused. "I'd made camp at the north end of the section. I know now that was a mistake, staying inside the boundaries, but I didn't know then what the boundaries were. Around 2 o'clock a.m., The breathing started. I'd heard about it from the other rangers in a general way, the sounds in that section, the way animals avoided it. But I'd told myself it was geological, a cave system nearby, pressure variations, something that could be mapped and explained. That night I understood. It was none of those things. I got out of my tent. I turned on my flashlight, and at the tree line, 30, 40 feet back in the trees, they were standing there. I could see Cole. He looked exactly like the photograph his sister had given us. 24 years old, in his hiking clothes, exactly as he'd looked the day he came in, looking at me. Tate's hands moved slightly on the table. I walked toward him. For 40 minutes, I walked directly toward him, keeping the flashlight on his face. He never got closer. The distance stayed the same, regardless of how I moved, like he was painted on the inside of a sphere I was walking across the surface of. On the third day, I found his journal on a flat rock in the clearing, and I understood. Not because anything spoke to me, not because any explanation offered itself, but because I felt it the way you feel the edge of a cliff before you look over it. If I spent one more night in that section, I wouldn't walk out of it. So I walked out. I requested reassignment without explanation, and they let me transfer without asking, because I think they were relieved, because a ranger who walks away quietly is easier than a ranger who keeps looking. The kitchen was very still. "Why does it happen?" Dowd asked. "What is it?" Tate was quiet. For a long time. "My grandfather was from Haywood County," he finally said. "His family had been in those mountains for 6 generations, back before the park system, back before the Appalachian Trail existed as anything other than a series of hunting paths and old trading routes. When I was a boy, he told me about a place in the hills where the world folds over itself." He looked at Dowd directly. "A thin place. A place where whatever boundary separates here from somewhere else has worn thin from age, the way the knees of old work pants wear thin, until you can almost see through them." He said the old Cherokee had a word for it that translated roughly as the place that holds, the place that keeps what enters it. The rule was simple and very old. You don't sleep there. You don't stop for any reason. You move through quickly without lingering, and you keep your eyes on the trail, and you do not look at anything that appears at the edge of the trees. He spread his hands. Jacob Pruitt was tired. He stopped. He slept. Inside the boundary, Dowd drove back toward the ranger station. At midnight, on a mountain highway with no other cars on it, the dark ridge lines of the Appalachian Mountains rising on either side, like walls, the stars very sharp and clear above the gap. He thought about thin places. He thought about boundaries that wear through from age. He thought about Carl Bettis, at 41 years old, standing at the tree line, pressing against glass that bends but never breaks. He thought about what it means to be somewhere for 40 years that nobody is officially looking at. What Thomas Dowd wrote that night was not a standard incident report. It was 31 pages. He typed the entire document on his personal typewriter at his kitchen table. Working from his handwritten notes and his personal photographs, the coffee going cold beside him as the hours moved from late night to early morning, he typed with the focused calm of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it, who has moved past the deliberation into the work itself. He drove back to the station before first light and left the document in his district supervisor's inbox before anyone arrived. He documented everything. The pattern of disappearances going back to 1954, all 8 cases, with dates, names, ages, and the specific detail that appeared in every ranger's personal note and in none of the official records. The boots at the tent entrance, facing outward, the journals that continued past the date of disappearance, written from inside the experience of being taken by the fold. documenting in precise and ordinary language what it felt like to be present and aware, and completely unreachable, the two men who had arrived without identification and left with his evidence, the missing archive files, his conversation with Howell Tate, and on page 26, he documented something he had not yet told anyone. He had gone back to the Fold at night on October 3rd at 11 o'clock p.m. He had driven to the Mabry Gap trailhead alone, without authorization, and walked north into the section with a flashlight, a compass, and a camera loaded with fresh Kodachrome film. He documented this decision in the report, without apology, accepted full professional responsibility for the violation of protocol, and explained that he had made the decision because he believed the evidence he had gathered in daylight was insufficient, without a direct observation of the conditions described in the journals, and in Tate's account, he had stood at the entrance to the 1.2-mile section and listened. For 17 minutes, there was nothing. The ordinary silence of a mountain trail at night, which is not silence at all, but a textured, layered collection of sounds that an experienced outdoorsman learns to read, the way a conductor reads a score. Insects, wind in the canopy, the distant sound of water moving over stone, somewhere below the ridge, and then the breathing started, low, rhythmic, coming from somewhere beneath the surface of the ground, as if the mountain itself were alive and sleeping, and he had somehow gotten close enough to hear it, not the sound of an animal, or a geological process, or any of the explanations he had spent the last 10 days trying to apply to the descriptions in the journals, something that had no category, in the part of his mind that dealt in rational explanations, something that operated, in the part that was older. He raised his camera. He began photographing the tree line, and then, at the far edge of the flashlight's reach, at the margin where the light gave out and the dark began, they were there. He wrote, "I will not describe what I expected to see. I will only describe what I did see. They looked like people. They were standing 20 to 30 feet back in the tree line, mostly still, with the particular stillness of people who have been standing for a long time and have made their peace with the act of standing. I counted them carefully. 9. 8 missing persons across 4 decades of disappearances on this section of the Appalachian Trail, and Jacob Pruitt, who had been missing for 12 days. 9 people standing at the tree line, looking at the trail. He documented their positions. He took photograph after photograph, working systematically across the tree line from left to right, trying to resolve the details that the flashlight beam rendered soft and indistinct. Then, one of the figures moved. It walked out of the tree line and stopped at the edge of the trail, not crossing onto the path, stopping precisely at the margin, at the exact boundary between the ordinary world and whatever the Fold had made of that 1.2-mile section. It stood there, in the full beam of the flashlight. Dowd wrote, "I could see him clearly, a man in his early 40s, wearing clothing consistent with hiking gear from the early 1950s, durable, well-made, worn with use but not deteriorated, the clothing of someone who has been out in the woods for a very long time, but has not aged inside that time. I recognized him from the photograph in the Bettis file, the photograph I had taken with my personal camera before the files disappeared. It was Carl Bettis, 41 years old, in September of 1954. He looked 41 years old. Carl Bettis has been inside that mountain for 40 years, and he has not aged a single day." Carl Bettis raised one hand. Not a wave, not the uncertain gesture of a man trying to communicate across a distance he isn't sure is bridgeable. A specific, deliberate gesture. The raised hand of a man who has been practicing this moment for a long time and knows exactly what he means by it. He pointed back, toward the trailhead, toward the south, toward the 4. Dowd wrote, I want to be honest about why I turned around. Part of it was professional discipline. I'm a methodical man who understands risk assessment, who knows the difference between acceptable field exposure and something that exceeds it. But the larger part was something I can't categorize in those terms. I understood what Hal Tate had described, not intellectually, not as a logical conclusion. The understanding came from somewhere below language, the way you understand the edge of a drop before your conscious mind has processed the visual information. It arrived fully formed. And it said simply, if you stay one more night in this section, you will not leave it. Carl Bettis has been warning people away for 40 years. Standing at the tree line, raising his hand, pointing toward the trail. And nobody who could do anything with the information had ever stayed long enough to see it. I turned around and walked out. He developed the photographs the following morning, in the dark room at the station, before anyone else arrived. Every frame was black, not the grayish underexposure of film shot in poor light, not the washed-out overexposure of film facing a direct flash in darkness, completely, flatly, absolutely black, as if the film had encountered something that silver halide had no mechanism to capture. A quality of the light in that section of trail that photographic emulsion simply couldn't process, a frequency outside the range of the instrument. Every frame except one. Frame 17. Frame 17 showed the edge of the tree line and the flashlight beam. The trees were sharp and clear. The trail margin was distinct. The shadows fell correctly, the way shadows fall in ordinary light, and at the far edge of the frame, half behind a pine, at the absolute limit of the light's reach, barely resolved into a shape that could be called a figure. Someone was standing, looking at the camera. Dowd included the photograph. With the 31-page report, he submitted it on October 4th, 1994. On a clear October morning when the Appalachian Mountains were beginning to show their first color, the ridgelines touched with the red and orange of early fall, the sky above them very blue and very empty. His supervisor called him into the office. At 2:00 p.m., the call lasted 11 minutes. When Dowd came out, he walked to his desk and began clearing out his personal belongings, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had known this was coming. The transfer papers were already on the desk, already typed, already filled in, already prepared before the meeting had ended, as if the outcome had been decided, before he walked through the door. He signed them. He shook hands with two colleagues who happened to be in the room and didn't understand what they were watching. He was reassigned to a desk position. In Raleigh, he never worked a field assignment again. The 1994 case was sealed. Thomas Dowd retired from the National Park Service in 2003. He moved back to Western North Carolina. His former colleagues thought it was strange when they heard, a few of them, the ones who'd known him, who'd noticed the transfer and the 11-minute meeting and understood that something had happened without knowing what. Why would a man who'd seen what he'd seen want to live within range of it? Why come back to the mountains? But Dowd understood something that most people never have cause to learn, that proximity to a thing you cannot fix, cannot explain, cannot officially acknowledge, that proximity is sometimes the only honest posture left. The alternative is distance, and distance is another word for pretending. And Dowd had watched an institution pretend for 40 years, and he knew what pretending cost and what it left behind. The fold doesn't spread, whatever it is. Whatever force has worn that particular section of the Appalachian Mountains down to something thin and permeable, whatever the old word describes, whatever geology or history or accumulated weight of years has made that 1.2-mile section different from the 1.2 miles on either side of it. It is contained, specific, bounded precisely to the depression between those two ridgelines near Mabry Gap, a seam in the world that has been gathering the unwary for longer than anyone has been keeping records of it, and has shown no interest in all that time in expanding. The people inside it are still there. Carl Bettis. Stephen Cole, the man from Raleigh who left a tape recorder running in his pack. In 1978, Jacob Pruitt, who was 29 years old on September 18, 1994, and is 29 years old still, all of them, in a space pressed up directly against our own, close enough that the boundary between their world and ours can be felt as a physical thing, like glass, like pressure, like the surface tension of water, watching the seasons change in the canopy above the rerouted trail, watching the years accumulate, still the same age they were the day they came in, still aware, still pressing against the glass. In 1997, the trail through the fold section was quietly rerouted. A new path was cut around it through less interesting terrain, drier, more exposed, without the particular quality of light and the old-growth canopy that made the fold section, in other circumstances, genuinely beautiful. The official documentation cited trail erosion, a plausible enough explanation for a section of mountain trail in a high-moisture environment with significant root exposure. Nobody who didn't already know would question it. Thomas Dowd questioned it. He filed 3 separate formal requests with the National Park Service over the following years, requesting that the investigation be reopened, not necessarily publicly. He understood the institutional resistance to anything that couldn't be explained in terms the official record could accommodate, not necessarily with any expectation of resolution. He was not by that point operating under any illusions about resolution. He simply wanted the record to say something true. He wanted the record to acknowledge that 9 American citizens were present and aware in that section of trail, and that unresolved disappearances was not, in any meaningful sense, an accurate description of what had happened to them. All 3 requests were denied. In his final letter, sent in 2001, and never publicly disclosed, Dowd wrote, "I am not asking you to explain what is in the fold. I understand that you cannot. I'm not asking you to fix it or to close it or to make it into something that fits the categories available to this institution. I am not asking you to tell the public because I understand what telling the public would mean, and I'm not certain the public is served by knowing, and I accept that uncertainty. I'm asking you to acknowledge, in whatever internal document can carry the acknowledgement, that those 9 people are not dead. They are there. They can see out. They are fully aware of time passing, of seasons changing, of the trail being rerouted around them, of the searchers who came and left and never found them." Carl Bettis has been in that mountain since September of 1954. He is still 41 years old. He has been standing at that tree line for 40 years, watching the trail, watching the searchers come and go, raising his hand to warn the ones who come close enough to see him. He warned me. He pointed toward the trail, toward the way out. He saved my life. I don't know what he is now, what the fold has made of him over 40 years, what it means to be preserved and present and unreachable for that long. I don't have the words for what he is, but I know what he was. He was Carl Bettis, 41 years old, from Asheville, North Carolina. He came into these mountains in September of 1954 because he loved them. He walked them with the respect of a man who understood what they were. He deserves to have his name in a file that says what really happened to him, not unresolved, not missing, presumed lost. What really happened. He deserves that much. They all do. The letter received a 2-sentence acknowledgement from an administrative coordinator whose name Dowd had never encountered before and never encountered again. The investigation was not reopened. The 1994 case is still sealed. Jacob Pruitt was declared legally dead in 2001, 7 years after he failed to call Carol from a payphone in Hot Springs. His wife remarried in 2004. His children are grown now with their own lives built at a careful distance from the absence that shaped their early years. The negative space a missing person leaves in a family, the shape of a person made from what isn't there. Thomas Dowd is 67 years old. He lives in a house in western North Carolina, with a view of the dark ridgelines that divide Haywood County from the country to the north, the long shapes of the Appalachian Mountains against the sky, which are beautiful and unchanged, and hold what they hold with complete indifference to anyone's opinion on the matter. He has never publicly discussed what he found in the fold, but people who know him say that every September, in the last 2 weeks of September specifically, when the light in the mountains goes low and golden in particular, when the morning mist sits in the gaps between ridges, when the first color touches the upper canopy and the air has that specific smell that means the mountain is beginning to close itself down for the year. He drives out to the Haywood County road that runs closest to where the Mabry Gap trailhead used to be. He parks the car on the gravel shoulder. He doesn't get out. He sits there for a while, looking at the tree line, at the mountain, at the place where the trail used to go, before someone in an office somewhere decided it would be better if it went somewhere else. Then he drives home. Nobody knows exactly what he's doing out there. Some people who know him have asked, and he has smiled in a way that answers nothing and changed the subject. Maybe he's making sure the fold is still contained, still bounded, still specific, still holding whatever it holds inside those 1.2 miles without spreading. Maybe he's doing the methodical work of a man who spent 12 years learning this mountain and can't entirely stop keeping watch over it. Or maybe something simpler than any of that. Maybe he just wants Carl Bettis to know that somebody hasn't forgotten, that somebody knows the files were sealed and the trail was rerouted and the official record says unresolved and missing and legally dead, and knows what those words are standing in front of, what they were chosen to cover. Maybe he just needs Carl Bettis and Jacob Pruitt and all the others standing at their tree line in the space pressed up against ours to know that one person on this side of the glass is still looking back. That one person remembers. That one person drives out every September and parks on the gravel shoulder and sits there in the quiet of the Appalachian Mountains at the end of the season and knows that behind the tree line and beyond the rerouted trail and inside the 1.2 miles that the official maps now route around, there are 9 people who are still there, still 41 years old, still 24, still 29, still watching, still pressing, because that is the thing about the true horror stories that come out of these mountains. The Appalachian Horror Stories that don't make it onto any official record, that get sealed and buried and rerouted around and stamped with words like unresolved, that mean something very specific to the person choosing them. The ones that get erased so thoroughly that you have to go looking in misfiled maintenance folders and the personal notes of transferred rangers to find any trace of them. Those aren't the ones that end. Those are the ones that wait. In a space pressed against ours, in the last 2 weeks of September, 9 people are standing at a tree line, watching a trail that no longer goes where it used to go. The breathing comes up through the ground, slow and rhythmic and patient, the way it has come every night since 1954. The shadows fall at the wrong angle for the time of day. The compass drifts west, and at the edge of the frame, at the far limit of any light, a figure stands half behind a pine, watching, raising one hand. Not a wave, a warning, the same warning every September for 70 years. And the mountain keeps what the mountain keeps. This has been the Black Archive. Subscribe and send us your sealed files. Click the tape on your screen right now and keep going.